Uh, all right, we will get started. So we're going to be recording this conversation for folks who could not make it, but thank you all for joining us. My name is Jessel Noor. I'm the Democracy Cohort Manager for Solutions Journalism Network. This session is titled Lessons from Pro-Democracy Newsrooms. We have an incredible lineup of guests in this session, but before we start, I wanted to thank our partners for helping us promote these events and helping us put it on, and Democracy Day, which is a grassroots effort to raise awareness of the threats to democracy and encourage newsrooms to take a pro-democracy stance, is this Friday. If your newsroom has not signed up, please do so. We'll send out information in the follow-up email. And if you have any questions, you can also drop them in the chat. A few Democracy Day organizers are on this call. And before we start, I wanted to define a few terms we'll be using here. Pro-democracy reporting, as defined by US Democracy Day, acknowledges the reality of misinformation and the slippage of democratic norms, helps people engage more easily and readily with the systems designed to protect, enfranchise, and serve them. Essentially, it is everything that horse race coverage is not. As we lead into, as we are underway with the presidential election campaign season, and as we've heard from our previous three panels, horse race coverage just focusing on candidates, just focusing on the personalities of these candidates, or Donald Trump's trials, while these can serve some purpose and have some value, if we forget to do, if focusing on horse race coverage means ignoring communities, ignoring the stakes and what's at stake for democracy, it's leading us to a very dangerous path. But there are alternatives. And today we're joined by three newsroom leaders that are blazing that path. And so this is going to be a really exciting discussion. And I also wanted to describe solutions journalism, which is simply rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So in this context, it's not just enough to talk about the threats democracy faces, but it's important as journalists to talk about what's working to defend democracy and to expand it and actually, have have a real democracy, which has always been a struggle since this country's founding. And we want to. I just want to define these terms to sort of ground this conversation before we get started. So this is the fourth in our series. All these recordings are available online, and together I think they serve as a really powerful anecdote to everything wrong with political coverage in the United States, and really really provides journalists and newsrooms with alternatives on how best to, what the alternatives are and how best to implement them in your newsrooms, which is going to be the topic of this specific conversation. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Osita.
Thank you, Jessel. As Jessel said, this is the last in a series of 4 seminars on covering democracy. And these have been really terrific, and I hope informative conversations for everybody tuning in. And to close things out, we have not 2, but 3 panelists this time around, and I'll go ahead and introduce now. Jessica Husemam is the Editorial Director of Votebeat, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom covering voting. She manages the newsroom investigations and major projects. And prior to Votebeat, Jessica was the lead elections reporter for ProPublica, managing Electionland, collaboration between more than 100 newsrooms across the country covering the 2016, 2018, and 2020 elections. Ashton Lattimore is the editor-in-chief of Prism. She's an award-winning journalist, former lawyer, whose work sits at the intersections of racial justice, gender justice, and law. Her nonfiction writings appeared in the Washington Post, Slate, CNN, and Essence. She's a graduate of Harvard College, Columbia Journalism School, and Harvard Law School, where she was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. During her time practicing law, she was part of the team that represented Pennsylvania's governor in the lawsuits that successfully challenged the state's congressional map as an illegal partisan gerrymander, resulting in an implementation of a new map in time for the 2018 elections. She grew up in New Jersey and now lives in suburban Philadelphia. Finally, we have Darla Cameron. Darla Cameron is the managing editor for visual journalism for the Texas Tribune. She oversees the work of the photo, multimedia, and daily visuals teams, and works closely with the product engineering and design teams to elevate the Tribune's visual journalism. Previously, she was the data visuals editor, leading a team of developers at the intersection of graphics and news applications. Before joining the Tribune, she worked at the Washington Post and the Tampa Bay Times. Darla is a Colorado native with a degree in journalism from the University of Missouri. Thanks to all three of you for being here for this. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful conversation, as all of these seminars have been so far. So I guess I could just sort of start by trying to frame, I guess, the challenge newsrooms are going to face in covering this next election from a democracy perspective a little bit. What are some of the major beats that you think a pro-democracy newsroom ought to have? As we head into the next election season, what are your own institutions, your publications going to want to have covered as a basis when you're thinking about covering democracy as a subject? And anybody can start. Maybe Jessica can take the lead.
I feel a little bit spoiled by this question because we only cover voting and we only cover voting all the time. So I'm biased in that perspective. I think everybody should cover that, but I don't really have anything else to add.
I'm happy to hop in. At Prism, we focus quite a bit on voting rights, but in addition to that, we have kind of an expanded definition of democracy. So we also look at things like free speech and the right to protest quite a bit, in addition to covering sometimes journalism itself as sort of a necessary condition for the existence of democracy. So I think adding those things to the mix is also important.
At the Tribune, we also cover politics and policy and, democracy writ large in a state that has a lot of challenges in terms of equitable access to voting and public services, and just so many things here are products of our democracy, right? So I think the main thing I want people to be aware of, and a beat I would like to see for the next election, is visual misinformation. Specifically, we're all going to need to be looking out for how to identify things generated by AI, and the way that that landscape will shape the false narratives that campaigns can use to try to tell their own stories.
Right. So here's another way of framing the question, and Darla kind of got at it, is, this is such a multifaceted topic, as we've explored in the past conversation. You can talk about the impact of redistricting and gerrymandering on people's access to, or the meaning of people's votes. You can think about restrictions on voting rights. You can think about visual misinformation, as Darla just said. So if you're in a newsroom that has the ambition of covering democracy in a really robust way, how do you kind of choose between those subjects? And also sort of thinking about assigning roles for people. Does it make sense to say, well, somebody's going to be our misinformation person, somebody's going to be our voting access person? Is that the way that you think beats should be constructed, or is there a different sets of postures that might make sense for different publications?
I can start with this one. I think that we have one reporter in every state that is covering voting and elections as a whole. So for our specific newsroom, it doesn't make a ton of sense to say you're the misinformation reporter. Because they have such location specific beats. I think that unfortunately misinformation has become such a all-encompassing problem, and is not restricted to any one beat. So regardless of the beats that you're putting under the democracy umbrella, whether that's voting and extremism and white nationalism and free speech, all of these things are possible. I think that we need to really impart every journalist in our newsroom with the ability to be sort of really robustly and in real time debunking misinformation. And it's a very specific skill, but I think it's one that every journalist in the newsroom at this point has to have.
I think for us, we kind of take a mix of approaches. There are times when we have people who are directly focused on a democracy focused subject. For example, we did a series on gerrymandering. That reporter was just reporting on gerrymandering at that time. But by the same token, I think it is kind of a subject that has tentacles that reach into every other kind of corner of our coverage. So for example, we have one reporter who focuses largely on criminal justice. And sometimes that does look like reporting on whether or not people who are incarcerated have access to the ballot box or have retained the right to vote or regained it in some way. Or someone who's reporting mostly on reproductive rights, maybe reporting on that in a way that looks at the impact of, ballot measures or something like that in a state where it's something that's been put up for a vote. So I think giving people the ability, much like Jessica said, kind of empowering every reporter to touch on the subject, no matter what their beat is, in addition to having people who are focused very directly on democracy-focused subjects, I think is helpful.
I also agree. It needs to be holistic. Like what I would like to see is all journalists, not just always reporters, but data reporters, photographers, like everyone kind of equipped with the tools to be able to assess situations, and all of us listening to readers and listening to their concerns, hearing what it is they have questions about. I think a lot of those like solutions journalism tools can be really useful when we listen really.
Ashton, you just mentioned, empowering reporters. I like that phrase. And when we think about all of the outlets that have, and this is good news, jumped into the field of covering democracy, or at least taking democracy more seriously as a subject in advance of this election, what are some of the resources that ought to be made available, editorial resources to journalists, especially at newsrooms that are, maybe covering this issue or this set of issues for the first time? Because it can be a kind of challenging area to wrap your head around in some ways. And I can think about that in two ways. One challenge is the wonkiness of some of the election law and, some of the technical aspects of how the vote actually works. Some of the legal language, some of this might be, I think, a little bit challenging for journalists to sort of tackle for the first time if they don't have a kind of institutional background at a publication of covering this field before. And the other challenge I think about is the need to cover marginalized communities specifically and the threats to voting rights for them. These communities are often underserved by media generally already, when you think about the poor and immigrants. So maybe there are editorial resources that might be specifically aimed at penetrating those communities and making sure that the reporting is disseminated in the places where they need it most, making sure that they have resources available to translate articles and so on. So those are two areas I think about and that come first to mind when I think about some of the challenges that come from covering this area. But what are some of the editorial resources that you think that can be made available to journalists to address those and other challenges in covering democracy?
I think some degree of sort of baseline legal education is actually really helpful. That might look like, a newsroom sharing maybe just a guidebook that kind of explains basic concepts around things like gerrymandering or the vote or how a case comes into court a particular way and, something like that. And there are also kind of external programs that I know exist for journalists who want to get a more deep grounding in the legal structures that form our democracy. I think there's a program out of I want to say UC Berkeley or one of the colleges out in California, the law schools out in California. It's like law school for journalists where it's a program.
Loyola, sorry.
Yes, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, a shorter program that gives kind of that introductory basis to all of these things, because it can be incredibly technical. And I think there's a big risk with journalists who are not educated in at least the baseline concepts of being vulnerable to sources who know more than they do and being tempted to sort of parrot something someone says back to you because maybe you don't understand all the details, you don't know the right questions to ask, just like straight up logistical questions about, why did you file this case in this court, or who is responsible for making the laws that surround these local elections? Is it the state? Is it the local officials? I mean, who's in charge here? Just sort of basic baseline questions that can be answered up front that I think really will equip journalists with the ability not just to write better stories, but really to ask better questions when there are people in front of them who may be trying to sell them a line about something that's actually not true.
So before our reporters are allowed to start reporting, they have to go through a 2-week long training process with me. which, you know, I guess that's a good thing. Maybe for them it's not. But you know, I think that the reason we decided to do that is because of all the reasons that Ashton just said, right? Like the voting process is incredibly technical, and a lot of the misinformation that we see about voting and elections and redistricting and all of this is because it's so complicated that people have good faith misunderstandings about how it works, right? And part of the reason that they have these good faith misunderstandings, right, like they really fundamentally think something works in a way that it does not work, is because journalists have never explained it to them. And so it becomes hard to debunk information if you don't know immediately that the information is incorrect. And so if somebody is telling you something about a voting machine, and it sounds plausible, you might believe them because that seems like that's how it should work. But they're very specific things that require a little bit of understanding. And so I think like really having an ingrained understanding of the beat is so important. And when I am approached by other newsroom leaders who are like, well, how do I do the same sort of thing in my newsroom? The thing that I say is every single one of your reporters who is covering voting or elections in any capacity should go to poll worker training, not to be a poll worker, but to understand what the machines are, how they work, what the local laws are, because they are different from your county next door. The machines are different, the rules are different, the polling locations are different, right? And if you go to your county's poll worker training, which most counties are game for, like if you say, I want to come to poll worker training off the record just for my own understanding of the system, they will allow that. I've been to 17 of these, and they're really good.
I think another thing we've kind of tried to develop process-wise at the Tribune to try to make that kind of information more accessible when we're covering a state with 254 counties. And I would love to be able to send like all of our reporters to poll worker training in every single county. That would be super fun, but we just don't we don't have time. That's not realistic. You know, it's kind of trying to put things into context for readers. And we have two different products that we kind of product lines for each election that we publish to try to do that. First is a voter guide with really actionable information from our data engagement reporters. It's SEO optimized to reach new audiences. It leads to huge newsletter signups, like just something for that basic information. Once we understand it, we want to communicate it to people in the most clear and simple way possible. The other aspect of that is an internal elections database. It's an API that powers customizable ballot pages, election night's result pages, analysis, and eventually our elected official directory. So the whole election isn't like, oh, it's election night, time to think about it. But we're thinking about like the deadlines to register, the deadline for early voting, like all the pieces along the way, the primary, the runoff, the general election, like all those things that lead up to now here's these elected officials that were elected to be accountable to you. So we want to make that process more accessible to people and then kind of scope our coverage to say, okay, for each of these, like what matters right now? There's these built-in deadlines. Like I can tell you exactly what we're going to be doing for the next year as we prepare to like begin that whole cycle of covering an election.
So a related question for the three of you would be whether you think that there are places where other outlets that are already covering democracy, covering threats to voting rights, and all of this material should improve based on maybe what we've seen in the past couple of election cycles specifically. Are there lessons that you think we can learn from the way the outlets have covered this set of issues for the last couple of years?
If there is a story that you know that every other news outlet is going to cover, don't cover it. Cover something else. This is a conversation that we have all the time, which is, you know, every newsroom has a limited number of resources, right? And I think that a lot of coverage choices come down to like, well, if we don't cover this, we're going to be the only news organization that isn't covering this. Well, like, then fine, don't do it. You know, I think that journalists should take better stock of sort of the unique coverage they can offer, and if there is truly a story that you're only covering because you're afraid, because you've got FOMO, then like democracy is better served by you covering something else. And so I think that if journalists got out of that mindset, then we would have more diverse coverage, just as a natural result of that, of everyone saying, okay, this is the unique perspective I can add to this, rather than we need it because everybody else has it. And I think that the horse race coverage that we see, especially going into election years, like, oh, well, we need to do this like, I swear to God, if I hear the word curtain raiser another time, I'm just going to jump out of my window. So, you know, I mean, I think that that's one area where, especially if you're a local news organization and you're watching, you're saying, I have so few resources, then deploy your resources on unique products that you can offer.
Jessica, is there a specific example within the democracy field specifically of a kind of story you've seen too much of that's really bugging you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the iterative coverage of court cases is really harmful to democracy as a whole. And, you know, especially this close to an election, the court cases are so complicated and they're under so many stays, and the decisions can feel so monumental, but then they're reversed the next week, right? And so what I see every year is, okay, well, this judge just put out a ruling and we have to cover what it means right now, even though you, as a reporter who has been following this trial, know that decision is going to be different the next day, and your reporting is going to have a shelf life for 24 hours. But you're not going to go and update that piece to say like, oh, this is no longer operative, right? We could just slow down, right? And we could just choose to not cover things when we know that there isn't going to be a long-term impact of something so close to the election. I think the best example of this that I've seen is when Texas implemented it. I know this is a bit of a throwback example. When Texas implemented its voter ID law in 2017, the number of news organizations that had covered that the case that SB1 was overturned in the weeks leading up to the election, when it wasn't, it was just a small portion of it was overturned. People freaked out when they went to the polls and were asked to present their ID in 2016, 2018, and 2020. And it's because the media failed them. And so I think like the temptation to do iterative coverage at every step of a very complicated process is just a very bad idea.
I mean, huge plus one to all of that. I also hate when, like, there have been so many SB1s in Texas since then, like media's tendency to refer to things by like the bill name as shorthand and assume that people know what you're talking about. Ashton, can I ask a question? I'm curious, like, one of the things that I see in all that legal coverage is a lot of times journalists like don't fully understand, so they tend to use legalese. And if I had $1 for every time somebody's tweeted like the judge has overturned it and remanded, like things that I'm just like, I do not follow, like I don't understand, and I theater should know a little bit. Like, how do you get journalists as a lawyer? Like, how do you talk to journalists about how to make that kind of legal language accessible to average people?
Oh my gosh. I wish I could remember. I think it was about one of the abortion laws that came out where there was some case where what the reporter was trying to talk about was that there was like a reversal of a stay of an injunction. And it's like, you have to follow it all the way back. And what I try to do when I see something like that, because that to me is a flag. If I see a sentence where somebody's written, this judge, you know, just reverse the stay of this motion to dismiss, blah, blah, blah. Okay. If you're just regurgitating that to me, that tells me that you don't actually know what current state this case is in. So I'm going to sit with you. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to walk you through it backwards. So what does it mean to reverse this motion? Or what does it mean to you know, whatever it is? And then we're going to take it and put it in plain language. What does this mean right now? Is the case going to continue and XYZ is going to happen tomorrow? Is the case closed for all intents and purposes? Is it going to go up for an appeal? But I think, moving away from the legalese to just understand, like, fundamentally, just what does this mean? What is it? Where is it today? Where is the case today? And where is it headed tomorrow? And what does that mean? And trying to put that in plain language, I think is very difficult. And if I didn't have an education in civil procedure, I wouldn't be able to do it. So I don't know, I don't blame anyone who sees these terms and, can't parse them or tries to parse them and arrives at, not the wrong conclusion, in a good faith way. So I think having someone ideally in your newsroom who is able to parse that kind of language with the reporter, or giving the reporter the skills themselves to be able to parse that kind of language and eliminate it to the extent possible from the story, so that you can just tell readers in plain English kind of what's going on here, is useful. I share your frustration with people referring to things by their bill names. Half the time I don't even know what's being being referenced in a given state, SB1 or HB whatever. So certainly if there are kind of names that these bills have been given that are more informative about what they are, or simply saying what the bill does, that's a much more useful way to refer to things. And that's something that we also just try to encourage, just kind of, tell people what you're talking about, which seems straightforward, but it's not always.
So as I think everybody here knows, and everybody tuning in surely knows, these are really rough times for a lot of local publications, small journalistic outlets. Even in sort of ordinary non-election times, we're seeing fewer and fewer reporters in state houses. And so there are a lot of publications that could be doing this kind of work and might want to be doing this kind of work, but don't have the resources to do it. And one of the solutions, though, that's come up is forging partnerships with different institutions, partnerships across different publications teaming up. I'm really glad we have Votebeat here to sort of talk about this. But I guess my question is, how should newsrooms that want to be doing pro-democracy coverage go about finding and forging partnerships with different institutions and outlets to do that kind of work? Institutionally, structurally, how does that work for a publication?
Yeah, I'll tell you how partnerships are sort of the reason for our existence at Votebeat. So in Texas, all of our work goes to the Tribune. In Pennsylvania, it all goes to PA Spotlight. And in Michigan, it all goes to Michigan Bridge. Arizona, we have a couple of different ones. And then our national stories, we find partners for them individually. So on Democracy Day, we'll be releasing something with The Guardian, which I'm really excited about. And so, I think that because for all of the reasons that we've talked about in this panel, right? Like voting is so specific and it requires such a level of expertise. A lot of newsrooms don't cover it, not because they don't want to, but because it is difficult to do, right? Like it is a difficult thing to say, like, okay, we're going to take this reporter who has never covered voting before ever, and then we're going to send them down to a federal court in Corpus Christi, Texas, where like maybe they'll follow proceedings, I guess, right? Like that's a difficult thing to do. But like our newsroom sort of exists to help rooms do that well. So we provide training programs. All of our stories are Creative Commons licensed. And I think that is an important thing to note. If your state has nonprofit newsrooms, their articles are probably Creative Commons licensed. That is a huge invitation to reach out to do more partnerships with them. Nonprofit news organizations love doing this sort of stuff, like cold email. I promise it will work. I get cold emails all the time. We almost always partner with everyone who asks. And it's because it's a huge part of our mission. So I think that, partnerships are easier to forge than people realize. And I'm always sort of surprised. I've always worked in nonprofit media, which I realize is like a huge privilege and unique. So it's always sort of like strange for me when I go to other newsrooms and they're like, how do you partner? And I'm like, what do you mean? You just call, you just do the partnering, which I realize is like very naive. But I think that what you'll find is that most newsrooms are way more comfortable sort of giving parts of their work to other newsrooms than they used to be.
Huge +1 on partnerships. The Tribune always says we have no competitors, only collaborators. And we really try to operate that way. I do think that managerially, partnerships are not cost-free. So I like to talk to editors and the people who will be managing those about like, okay, how do you set your expectations for the work that everyone's bringing to the table? How do you make it clear, like shared photography costs? Like journalism is not free to produce. So we try when we enter those partnerships and think about how we want to work with other outlets, we want to make sure that it's something that aligns for our shared goals. We try to have like of understanding and, you know, just like things to kind of set some guardrails in terms of expectations. And then also, you know, acknowledge that it takes more than a reporter to make a partnership. There's audience teams, there's other folks in the room who need to be involved with thinking about like the reach of that work, how to distribute it. That said, the Tribune, this has always been our model. We give all of our work away for free. Anyone can republish it. It's accessible. We want people to get this information. And we want also, when we do partner, we want other outlets that we work with to be aware of the environments that they're entering. I think it's not really democracy related, but our Uvalde coverage is a really good example of this. We spent more than a year in that community, developing relationships with sources, developing a level of trust. And when we went in with a national partner to do stories alongside them, we wanted everyone to be on the same page about like, here are expectations about what we're going to say to sources as we learn things about this case that might impact their lives and their understanding of it. Like, it's just, you know, that partnership goes both ways. And we consider a big part of that to be our obligations to the communities that we cover and to doing that work in a respectful way. So yeah, partnerships are the best though.
I don't know that I have a ton to add. We're also a nonprofit, so all of our work is also similarly available to anyone who wants to republish it. And we have similar kind of considerations around partnerships as well. So yeah, I'll just let you go to the next question.
Sure. So yeah, one more question before we turn over to some of the questions that people in the audience today have submitted, some questions that people have been submitting across the seminars, between the seminars. Yeah, we'll turn to those in just a minute. But I did want to ask if there are stories that the three of you already know that you want to see as we move into this next election, different subjects that you already know that you want to have covered, maybe specific story items that you think are important enough that you're already keeping an eye on them. What are some of the stories that you three are most excited to see people cover?
Something that I would love to see more outlets cover and that we plan to continue covering is a lot of the legislation around the right to protest. That's really a fundamental sort of baseline right within a democracy. And, you know, when you start to see that right be eroded in a lot of the ways that it has been over the last, say, 4 or 5 years, alarm bells should be going off. So we're going to be spending a lot of more time tracking legislation, like anti-protest legislation, you know, things like laws that make it legal to physically harm protesters, for example, and covering those kinds of incursions to sort of those secondary democracy rights that in a lot of ways make voting rights and other things possible, and protect them and protect the outcomes that hopefully come from those voting rights. So that's where a lot of our focus, I think, is going to be.
I think a big plus one to that, like acknowledging that voting is not the only way that people participate in democracy, and that for some people who don't have the right to vote, or, you know, it's not accessible to them for whatever reason, kind of acknowledging they have other ways to make their voices heard. And so kind of I would like to see places more holistically report on that aspect, and also just really hold officials accountable for accessibility. And that means a lot of different things for different individuals. And that there's, but kind of acknowledging like not everybody has the same ideas or comes from the same places that we do when they're thinking about how they participate and how they get to the polls, how they are going to vote, how they do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think, so one thing that I'm sort of concerned about and is the rollback of public records access across the country. There's like currently a law in Arkansas that would really limit how much access you're allowed to get from information that comes from the governor's office, right? And sort of public records are like the lifeblood of journalism, but they're also the lifeblood of like basic government transparency and access. And so I think all of the things that we've been talking about today sort of stack on that. And I would encourage people to become like way more aware that there probably are bills in your state house that affect public records access in some way, and to be especially sensitive to those, because as newsrooms, like, we should take a position on those. Like, we should. They're part of how we do our work. And the other thing that I would say is, I think that people should really think hard about coverage that they can do for language minorities in their communities. And by this, I don't mean just like translating the stories that are on your website, because a lot of times they need different information than what is available on your website. And so to the extent that you have a native speaker in your newsroom that you can repurpose for covering a community that you do not cover, and that has a language specialization that your newsroom needs, I would consider that. We've had a lot of really good success, sending our reporters in the language that these communities speak and getting the information that surprises us as like non-speakers of this language about what information is missing there. And so it might surprise you in terms of like the different information that some groups have access to and some groups do not.
Terrific. So a couple of questions from people who are watching or people who've been watching the seminars for the past couple of weeks. And the first one is, what are the differences in values and approach, if any, between non and for-profit newsrooms in pro-democracy reporting?
I think this is a really interesting question. I think that there's a temptation, although when I tease it out, largely they realize that this is a distinction without a difference, right? Where people feel uncomfortable taking a position on anything as journalists, but I would like proffer that like taking a position on people being able to vote is not really a position so much as it is just like our responsibility as a country. I also think, like, I'm just like small high horse here, is that like journalism is protected in the Constitution specifically so that we can inform voters who will then vote, right? So like our whole job is like predestined to be for voter education. And so if we cannot take the position that people should be able to vote and have access to the ballot, then like we have defeated our own purpose, is like my position on this issue. I think that for-profit newsrooms that I've spoken to are really uncomfortable with that idea that like, when I do trainings, I will encourage legacy newspapers to actually print a voter registration form in their newspaper. And 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, oh, that feels too partisan. Like, that's crazy. That's a crazy thing to say. And usually when I point that out, they're always like, oh, no, I see what you mean, but it hits the ear wrong. And so I think that like the difference that I see between for-profit and nonprofit newsrooms approaching the space is just that level of thought that they're giving to sort of participation and the importance of it.
Plus one to all of that, I think just picking up a bit on what Jessica just said, I think there is within nonprofit newsrooms and less so within for-profit spaces, an understanding that journalism itself is not a neutral act. So it's an intervention. The act of reporting on something is by nature going to change the situation than, if you had done nothing or said nothing. And I think that's a position that nonprofit newsrooms, because we're mission driven, mission oriented, many of us, come into this work with particular points of view, something that we're just largely more comfortable with and comfortable owning. I think where there's a problem is that journalism is an intervention, whether you say it is or not. So you have for-profit newsrooms that are intervening in democracy situations by reporting on something or choosing not to report on something, and that has a real impact. And if you kind of put your head in the sand about what the impact of what you're saying or not saying is doing, I think that can really impoverish the journalism that comes out of some other newsrooms. And I think sort of walking hand in hand with that, I would say probably the biggest difference is just the understanding of who the main character is of a democracy story. I think for many outlets that report on politics from sort of a for-profit lens, the main character of a politics story is the politician. You know, how is Ron DeSantis doing today? You know, is his hero's journey going to take him to the White House or not? Whereas a nonprofit newsroom that's focused on particular communities, our main character, our protagonist, who we're concerned about, who the center of the story is, are people, communities, you know, not what is Ron DeSantis doing today and why, but how is what he has done impacting the people who live in the state of Florida, or threatening to impact the people across the United States because of XYZ that he might do as president. So I think a focus on policy over personality is where you can also see a pretty strong distinction.
I have nothing else to add. Big plus one.
So yeah, I guess, you know, related to this, we have another question about framing and sort of our willingness to be unapologetically pro-democracy as journalists. How often should editors guide headlines and context to directly warn and educate readers about authoritarianism, or the risk of authoritarianism, and losing democracy? Anyone can start with that one.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that this question makes an interesting distinction between the role of an editor and the role of a reporter. So I'll just talk a little bit about how I think of that in terms of the context we offer things. So I expect all of our reporters to be experts in their own states. And my role in the newsroom is that, like, I'm an expert on voting policy, right? And so, like, the all of the stories that you see, like, they're becoming that, right? Like, I'm not going to need to support them in that for very long, because they, like, you pick up on this pretty quickly. But I think the place that I see myself intervening most is in sort of the voting space as a whole, and in introducing sort of like sidebars that we can do as explainers, or sort of explainers on the mechanics or the underlining civics education behind something that a person will need to understand versus what a reporter understands. I think like one of the biggest roles that editors can have is pulling their reporters out of the weeds. And so to that end, right, I think that there's a huge role for reporters or for editors to sort of think about the normative situations that arise from a person's coverage and make sure that we're offering the context that readers need in order to engage with that in an appropriate way. And sort of like this mission-driven aspect of nonprofit newsrooms that we've all talked about sort of accelerates that thinking a little bit, I think. But that's the context I'm generally giving.
I mean, I think plus one to that, like, the headline can't say something the story doesn't say, because then it would be inaccurate, right? So I think the editor's role is more so like, okay, who are we centering in the story? How are we framing the story? Are we asking the right questions to get to a place where this will be information that's accessible and understandable by our readers, and like anticipating what it is they need to know about the situation? So I think it's a little more like the headlines at the end. And at that point, there shouldn't really be disagreement about whether the headline can reflect what the headline can say, because it's really all about, like, what are we presenting and how are we presenting it to people? Sometimes a long narrative isn't going to be the best way to get somebody information about voting, where they need a more structured story format or FAQs or, you know, sidebars, or maybe it needs to be presented on like a visual platform, right? Like there's so many ways to tell stories. So I more want to get, you know, what my role at the Tribune is like reframing our presentation and our storytelling, and how are we getting this to people in a way that can reach them where they are and is understandable for them. So it's bringing it down to, you know, another, and it might feel basic, it might feel like things that are really like obvious to us, but that doesn't mean it's obvious to everyone. And I've seen a conversation in the chat about like, what are the questions that people in these communities need to know? Like, you've got to go into those spaces and be willing to know that like they might need something else.
I agree with all of what's been said so far, particularly Darla mentioning, you know, our role as editors can be to pull reporters out of the weeds. I think using headlines, subheads, and things to highlight what the stakes of a story are, that feels appropriate as long as it accurately reflects kind of what's in the story. I don't know, but I think also making sure that you have a mix of different stakes to some extent. Like every story is not necessarily going to be ringing the alarm about authoritarianism, but the ones that are and should be labeled as such. So I think making sure that there's also kind of a mix in scope and approach is really critical, just so that your readers are getting kind of the full breadth of what an issue might be. And mixing in solutions journalism is one of the ways that we do that specifically. So that's always something that I look to encourage as well.
Right. Yeah, one last question jumping up of what Ashton has just said. We've been convened here by the Solution Journalism Network, which is committed to helping journalists not only cover policy problems, but some of the solutions that policymakers and others have sort of framed and presented for the problems that we're facing as a country. So I guess, we could end by, on an optimistic note, just each of you maybe talking about the importance of presenting readers and voters with some of the things that people have been doing to fight back against restrictions on voting rights, some of the policies that have been implemented. Maybe each of you could take a turn to talk about some of the positives and some of the good stories you're seeing on this front, maybe some that your own outlets have covered, solutions to Texas democracy, ways that policymakers and others have sort of bolstered democracy, protected voters and the right to vote.
Sure. One set of stories that we did right in the midst of redistricting that took place after the 2020 census was a series of solution stories about gerrymandering. So the different ways that community groups, advocates, attorneys have looked to take on both partisan and racial gerrymandering, which often walk hand in hand with each other, but kind of are legally situated a little bit differently in that, one is technically okay, partisan gerrymandering. Currently, there's no way really to combat it through the courts, whereas racial gerrymandering is at least nominally frowned upon by the Voting Rights Act. So we looked at things like independent redistricting commissions that citizens within different states have stood up to kind of take the redistricting process out of the hands of legislators, for example, who of course are going to be inclined to tilt the results of a map toward their own party and put that power back in the hands of the people. We have looked at some of the court cases that have been attempted to address partisan gerrymandering with sort of varying levels of success, noting that there's actually been more success on that front in state court rather than federal court. So there's nothing that the Constitution of the US can do about it, but it seems that there is something that the Constitution of, say, Pennsylvania or another state can do about partisan gerrymandering if it's read that way by judges. And there have been additional efforts as well that we covered, just all solutions focused on how people are looking to basically make sure that everyone's vote actually counts equally across different states. And that was really heartening to see. And it's always nice to kind of lift up those solutions in a way that hopefully can be replicated across different states. So, yeah.
I love that example, Ashton. That's really great. I wanted to, Carol had asked a question, like mainstream media has a headline problem. And I think that like at least for us, the nonprofit media headlines are picked up by mainstream media. That's our distribution model, is that we cover the Capitol for other outlets in Texas. So like that is the headline they're getting. They might like adapt the headline on our story to make it fit for print or whatever. But I think like nonprofit it's not like fully the solution, but it is a way to say like, hey, we're covering these communities. We have a perspective. We're in the communities in a different way and making that information more accessible for everyone. I think for a win, I come from a data and graphics background, and I really love all the innovation around the way that people are presenting election results. And I think that there's creative ways of visualizing that information that makes it more clear that in Texas, there's counties with 3 million people and then counties with 54 people, and they're the same size on the map. And like, how can we make it clear that like they don't have the same weight, So we experimented at the Tribune with different ways of visualizing that information to make it more obvious that like this map is misleading. And I love all the experimentation around that. I think that even then some of those graphics like assume a visual literacy that is not accessible to everyone, but the more like space, I see us as a space to experiment and to try things out and to kind of iterate on ways that people visually understand information. to make this kind of thing more accessible for our readers. So that's a big aspect for us as we like to try.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I would encourage newsrooms to think about is if there is a bill that doesn't look like it means anything, it probably does. So, you know, I think that there's every year, especially in the voting space, we end up sort of like being surprised 6 months before an election because there's this new law that no one understood sort of like the outer edges of and the way that it impacts people who go to the polls or the people who administer the elections. Like one very good example of this is a story that came out of our partnership with the Texas Tribune that our Texas reporter Natalia, who was just on one of these panels a couple of weeks ago, wrote about this weird bill in which like one senator had this weird idea about voting machines and wrote an extremely technical bill that was not clearly about voting machines, but ultimately would have required every voting machine in the state of Texas to have a CD drive in it. And this bill was passed on a voice vote unanimously because nobody knew what it was, right? Like this is the problem with state legislatures is that these people are not experts in the things that they're writing laws on. And so very frequently they're just like, oh, this seems fine. They pass it and amendments get passed that way. Really, like the reason that we found out about that is because we're really plugged in with county clerks, right? And so we had county clerks being like, have you seen this crazy bill, right? But there are not that many people who are talking to county clerks every day, right? And so I think if there is a specific target like demographic that you're interested in or that you're particularly concerned about for your coverage, go to the people who are responsible for carrying out whatever that thing is, right? Like maybe it's education. And so you need to go straight to like the high school principal, or maybe it's elections. So you go straight to the county clerk, be like, what laws are you most worried about? And cover whatever it is that they say. Because even if it doesn't facially seem like something you should be worried about, it probably is.
Oh, Jessica, Ashton, Darla, I think that's about as much time as we've got, but this has been a terrific conversation, a terrific way to end this series, and I hope everybody got a lot out of it. I know that I did, just sitting here and listening to the three of you. I think before we go, Jessel probably has a couple of notes that he wants to leave us with.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and you know, especially our panelists and Osita, and you know, just to celebrate the accomplishments of these fantastic newsrooms. You know, Jessica was talking about the story, you know, requiring Texas counties to replace their voting machines. That story saved the state $100 million. You know, the Texas Tribune, you know, enacted solutions in pro-democracy reporting in their voting guide. And, you know, so, you know, the argument is that by doing this alternative community focused reporting, you can't get traffic, right? Your work isn't going to be seen, but instead, you know, in 2022, their voting guide, which is community-based, it was based on a survey of over 1,700 participants and readers. It outpaced all their other reporting, all their other, you know, it had the highest traffic on their site, even compared to previous years. And Prism has done, you know, incredible work, award-winning work, which has led to increase in fundraising. And you know, their reporting around a 4-day work week led to them adopting a 4-day work week for their staff and raising money to do that. So this is not just, all that to say, this is not just like fun rhetoric. It's not just like, we're not just talking about this idea. You know, this has resulted in real tangible things that, you know, we can all, you know, journalists can learn from. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be in this conversation with all of you. You know, this session will be recorded. It is recorded. We'll send out the recordings of all these 4 sessions. We have a survey we'd like you to fill out, because if there's interest, we'll keep this going. We'll invite our panelists back, and we'll answer more of your questions. You know, we only got to a small fraction of all the great questions you had. And finally, Democracy Day is 15th. It's Friday. If you haven't already signed up, please do. A lot of newsrooms have already made content available for free to republish. So it's really a low lift, and you can be part of a movement to defend democracy and to actually help America realize democracy, which is, this ongoing struggle, which journalists play a key role in fulfilling. So thank you all for joining us. I'll stay on for a few minutes if you have any questions. Thank you.